as an American Academy for the Advancement of Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the U.S. Agency for International Development. In Sam's free time, Sam enjoys running, curling, and listening to traditional fiddle tunes. So thank you for helping me welcome Sam.
Well, thank you so much, Grace, and thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here today. So good morning, good evening, everyone. I'm Sam Sellers, and I hope in the next 10 to 12 minutes to talk a little bit at a fairly high level about some of the linkages between population and climate change. Next slide, please. So when putting together these slides, I was thinking about the terms that came to mind when I think about the relationship between population and climate change. I think for many folks on the call this evening, you probably recognize that there's some relationship between population and climate change, but it's an issue that often doesn't get talked about through the UN FCCC process. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I came up with three to articulate here. One, because it's complicated. And certainly in the next 10 minutes, I'm not going to get to a lot of the nuance that exists within this issue. What I will say is that both the number of people as well as other demographic factors like age structures matter, as does the consumption that we generate. And so both people and our consumption play a role in climate change, and disentangling those two variables is methodologically complicated. The second word that I came up with was controversial. The academic study of demography historically has been linked with the study of eugenics, that is using genetics to try and improve, I say that in quotation marks, the genetic fitness of the human population. And so talking about who should reproduce or who should not reproduce gets very controversial very quickly. And historically, those debates have been linked with preventing certain groups that are deemed as less desirable from reproducing. This idea of right people versus wrong people. And so it's easy to say that your group should continue to live your life as it is. It's another thing to suggest that, excuse me, other people should not be able to make their own reproductive choices. The third word I came up with was that it's uncomfortable, that choosing to have or not have a child is one of the most personal decisions that each of us can make during our lives. And it's not something that's easy to talk about. The reasoning that each of us has for making this decision is deeply personal to each and every one of us. But with that, I added a fourth word to this slide, and that word is important. That despite this being a complicated, controversial, and uncomfortable issue at times, it's really important to talk about. And I'm really glad that I have the chance here this evening, and I hope it's something that many of you are able to discuss in this simulation going forward. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show two graphs right now, just very simple, high-level graphs showing current population size as of 2020 for different regions of the world. And that's in the red bars. And then on the blue diamonds show the per capita emissions, the most recent World Bank data that I've seen. And what you see is that the least populated region of the world, North America, is the region that, of course, is contributing the most per capita to climate change. And by contrast, the regions of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, which are second and third most populated respectively, are contributing the least on a per capita basis. Next slide, please. So I'm showing you a second graph, and the CO2 numbers haven't changed, but instead of showing you the total number of people, I'm showing you population growth, and this is population growth through 2050, just as an example. And so up to 2050, according to the United Nations, if we use their medium projection, humanity is expected to add about 1.9 billion people to the planet. And a little over half of those people are going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. And a further 22, 23% or so are estimated to be in South Asia. And so these are regions of the world where right now emission levels are relatively low per capita. But as those regions of the world develop further, we would expect that the per capita emission numbers will increase. And of course, the overall population size in those regions is going to increase pretty dramatically. By contrast, many of the highest emitting parts of the world, East Asia, Europe, and North America, are likely to grow fairly little in the coming decades. And so the per capita emission reductions that we're likely to see in those regions are going to be offset to a substantial degree by the population growth that is going to occur in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. One of the questions that people will ask is, can fewer children help the climate? And there have been a number of studies that have set out to study this topic. And without getting too much in the weeds in terms of methodology, I'll just point to one of these studies that generated a lot of headlines a few years ago. And this was a study that looked at some of the different actions that individuals could take to reduce their personal carbon footprint. And these authors estimated that having one fewer child reduced an individual's carbon footprint by about 60 tons of CO2 equivalent. And that's 25 times more than the second most impactful action on their list, which was to live car-free. And so it had a huge, huge impact on one's personal carbon footprint to have one less child. This was done, the study was looking at Western societies. So in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, these savings would be different. But if we're looking at the developed world, one could make a compelling case that fewer children help the climate. But there's a key piece to this, which is that the assumption they made in generating this estimate was that children are going to generate emissions at the same rate as their parents. And that's not necessarily the case. If you could click forward, please. Next slide. Oh, the animation didn't work, it looks like. Okay, so on the previous slide, what I was going to show, if we could go back one slide, please. What I was going to show was that, in fact, this study was complemented by a different set of research that was done, including the impacts of various carbon caps and carbon policies that have been adopted in North America and the European Union. And instead of 60 tons per capita, a second set of authors estimated that the savings were about 4 tons per capita. So an order of magnitude lower in terms of one's carbon footprint for having one fewer child. Even if you were to take those set of assumptions, it's still the most impactful action that individuals can have, but it's much less important than it is if emissions stay at their current levels. Okay, now let's move on to the next slide. So there's other scholars who ask a different set of questions, whether fewer children can actually hurt the climate. And there are a couple of arguments that are made that I'll mention briefly here. One being that societies, in order to transition to a more sustainable future, need technological innovation, and they need policy change. And that policy change and that technological innovation is very often done by younger people who are extraordinarily gifted. And so this set of arguments suggests that the fewer kids we have, the fewer Einsteins there are going to be, the fewer leaders we're going to have in our society who are really going to make a difference in terms of changing policy. And so the fewer kids we have, the fewer people there will be to push society in the direction that we need to go. A second set of arguments revolves around age structure. And without getting too much into the demography, as there are fewer children born, the ratio of older people to individuals in the workforce who tend to be younger and middle age changes, and there tend to be more older people. And older people are expensive for governments. You have to pay pensions, you have to pay more for healthcare, and that's really expensive. And at the same time, you've got less tax revenue to pay those expenses because there are fewer people in the workforce. And so what will happen, according to these scholars, is that governments will pay for the healthcare, they'll pay for the pensions, but they're not going to make the sorts of investments that are needed in terms of transitioning our societies to a more sustainable future that are needed. And so we actually need young people in order to be paying into the system in order for it to transition to a more sustainable future. Next slide, please. So I want to talk very briefly about family planning. And I know that on some of the materials for this event, the term population control was used. And I don't know if that was a translation issue or what exactly, but I want to disavow the use of that term in particular, because it's a term that historically has been typically associated with reproductive policies that are coercive in nature. And so these are policies that historically can either encourage or discourage childbearing, but it's a term that's no longer commonly used. Instead, the family planning community has adopted this notion of sexual and reproductive health and rights, coming from the 1994 UN Population Conference in Cairo that reoriented family planning discourse around human rights. And there's this concept that's used in the family planning community to describe individuals who don't want to have a child right now, but are not using family planning, and that's referred to as unmet need. Next slide. I'll be about 2 more minutes if that's okay. This graph is just showing unmet need for family planning throughout much of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, with a handful of other countries in there as well. The numbers in parentheses show current population size. And what you see is that there is an enormous unmet need for family planning. Women who say they do not want to have children right now, but are not using contraceptives. And so that's an enormous opportunity for the family planning community to provide better quality services and better methods to meet the needs that women themselves have expressed. Next slide. And so I've got 4 key messages here. The first being that population matters for climate change, and this is something I'm really glad is being discussed in this simulation. In the article that I asked you to read, Bongartz and O'Neill talk about the difference between Pakistan and Bangladesh, and how Bangladesh has adopted a more robust family planning policy than Pakistan, and that slowed the growth of the population growth in Bangladesh. And that's allowed the Bangladeshi government to offer better educational opportunities, better access to health services, and better economic opportunities for people in that country versus Pakistan. And so the choices that we make now affect development outcomes and the ability to mitigate later on. Additionally, family planning matters. And in many of the fastest growing countries in the world, women have expressed a preference for having fewer children, but are not using family planning. And so we need to make stronger investments in family planning services and also women's education. Next slide, please. Also, there's a tendency sometimes to distill climate to be just about population. And I want to say emphatically that it's not just about population and it's not just about consumption, that both matter. And right now with the Paris Agreement, consumption matters more for meeting some of the short-term targets. But when we think about long-term goals, if we're not reducing emissions very much, then population is going to matter a lot more. And that gets to the last point, which is that if we reduce our emissions per capita now, then that's going to minimize whatever impact future population growth has. So thank you so much for providing me the opportunity this evening, and I wish everyone the best of luck as the simulation concludes. Thank you so much.